Hey, Hemaverse fans, Colin here. Just wanted to let you know that we have started a Facebook page. Yes, that's right. We are now Facebook official. So, after you like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel, check us out over on Facebook, or if you prefer, Instagram. Coming very soon, a Twitter. Thanks, and enjoy the show. Welcome again to Into the HEMAverse, your podcast for everything going on in the HEMAverse. I'm, of course, Colin Vredenberg, and with me, as always, my co-hosts, David Rao
Hey.
and Nathan Graperes.
Still with my beard.
Today, we have a special guest, Bert Gevaert. Bert Gevaert, who is an academic and practitioner, will be joining us to talk about Belgian shooting and fighting guilds. That's going to be exciting. But before I forget, guys, how was your week this week? What's new?
David?
No, you have to go this time.
We just look at your face and we know what's new.
Yes.
I on Tuesday, I was playing around with some of Fiore's spear.
Oh, no.
And found some neat similarities between his, what does he call it? It's the right window, which is basically like right ox with a spear. And the play that you do from that is almost identical to one of Fabris's plays as well, the one where you sweep the rapier across the center line and then thrust. The spear play is exactly the same, and it's from like a different weapon in an earlier time period. And I also managed to make the same thing work with right ox in longsword sparring last night, which was a different way of using right ox that I've never done before. So that was cool.
Oh.
Cool.
Right ox is the crossed arm one, right?
Yeah, like this. So basically what you would do previously, all that I ever did was I would parry from it and like parry and then unwind with a strike around like that. But what you do is you bring it across the body, clearing away if they're in any of the lower guards, and as you do it, you clear it away and wind in for a thrust, and it works really, really well.
Oh, cool.
Because it doesn't give them enough pressure to make a follow-up cut around to the other side, because you're not actually smacking their blade, you're just aggressively clearing the line.
Huh. That makes sense. And do you do it with the blade or with the flat? Because I know that you've been working on doing more blade slapping with the flat.
I didn't pay attention to whether I was using the blade or the flat. I just unwound my arms and wherever made contact.
Fair. David, what's new?
I'm still working on my kind of project, my YouTube project. I'm going to be starting with there's a fencing treatise that doesn't really have a name. It's called like the new fencing treatise or new work on fencing, and it's a late 16th century German treatise that shows longsword and Dussac and other stuff. It's really interesting stuff. So I'm actually working on a translation of that, and simultaneously I'm putting together videos that demonstrate the different plays and how they work. So hopefully we starting to post those soon.
Cool. Yeah, keep us updated, because I might be interested.
You can post a link to the fencing book, but it's like I said, it doesn't really have a name. It just has.
And it's in German.
It's in German, yeah.
Which I don't speak or read, so it's not going to help me. All right, so
you can read it. You just don't know what you're saying.
Good point. Actually, no, I don't even think I could read it. I'd probably pronounce everything wrong.
It's kind of like Paul Hector Meyer.
Zing. All right, let's get into some news. We got actually a lot of news today. So first is some new news. The annual Give a Girl a Sword event, but it's usually put on by Esfinges. This year is going to be pandemic edition, but at least it's still going to happen, which is amazing. The first event has actually been posted. It is Let's Talk Ringin' with Marlene Hurst and Mariana Lopez. It's going to be a Facebook Live event. really cool. On July 29th, 3 p.m. Eastern United States time. I will leave a link in the description if you're interested. I assume there are going to be more. David, you have the inside scoop on that.
Yeah, there's a bunch of events actually, and I think they actually have put up a schedule now of when they will be and what they are going to be.
Cool. That's news.
So I believe I know that I know that there is a schedule. I don't know if the schedule has been posted, but there's going to be a bunch of events: longsword, sword and buckler, rapier. The first one, like you said, is going to be ring in related. So yeah, it's on their Facebook page, I believe. So we'll
cool.
Post the link there.
Well, if you're a listener and happen to be a woman or know any women, please let them know. It's a really cool event. Next up, we already talked about David's YouTube project, so we're going to move right along to the Academie Duello GoFundMe. It's still ongoing. So the Academie Duello is a school in Vancouver, Canada, and they're having a more than a rough time with the pandemic and continuing, and that seems to be continuing on. But they have opened up a GoFundMe so that people can either donate or buy lessons or online content. They are putting up a ton of online content. You probably know the school is run and owned by Devon Boorman. He's a great guy. The content he's been putting out has been amazing. Please check it out and donate and or get a class if you can. My personal favorite so far has been the Case of Rapiers class. That was a pretty interesting one.
The mysterious case of the two rapiers.
Mysterious case of the two rapiers. Well, it's actually really interesting because he shows you like obviously it's very easy to get tripped up in your own 40+ inch swords. So it's actually pretty interesting.
Yeah, actually, interesting historical note. I think it's Docciolini, who was one of the Italian fencing master who's not doing like what Morozzo and Manciolino are doing. Like it's a separate tradition, but at the same time, some call it the Florentine tradition, because they're in Florence. Him and a few other masters. He actually before he does rapier and dagger or sword and dagger, he does sword and then two swords and then sword and dagger, which is interesting.
Yeah, I mean that's not where your mind usually goes. It
No.
usually goes to like cloak and rapier and cloak first, or something. Not if it's not dagger, it's usually like another.
Yeah, usually when the two weapons are shown, it's like the very last thing that's shown. Huh. So,
well, speaking of rapier, the next one in the news is the Destreza lecture series put on by Sacramento Sword School. They've been putting on a whole lecture series. It's been running for probably over 2 months now. Some notable lecturers are Lois Spangler, who has translated a lot of the Destreza texts and retranslated them to be better translations. That's the key one right there.
That's a big deal.
Ton Pui was also a lecturer, and so was George Zakharopoulos was also a lecturer. And it's a phenomenal series. This week is Caden Wang, who I have never heard of, but obviously I will continue watching the series. It should be out about the same time as this video is, so I'll put a link in the description to the whole playlist of lectures that you can look up and watch along with me. Last but not least is Swords Without Borders, who have passed their initial $1,000 goal and are now up to $2,000. Awesome. Swords Without Borders is a raffle fundraiser that benefits Doctors Without Borders. It's put on by Bill Grandy of Virginia Academy of Fencing. But basically, as a side project, he said, well, I want to do a raffle and he has got some amazing prizes, 14 amazing prizes. And you can have a chance at any of those prizes for like $10 for one ticket. Yeah. And if you buy any tickets, you can create content on YouTube and upload it, and it will get you another 5 entries to the raffle. And if you can't donate at this time, hey, we totally understand. You can also help by just watching the videos and liking the ones that you like best, because the most liked video in the playlist will get an additional 5 entries on top of it, on top of the initial 5. All right. So, guys, are we ready to talk about Belgian shooting and fighting guilds?
I think so.
Yeah.
I don't know about David, but I am.
I am. I'm so ready.
All right. Well, let's bring Bert in. He's waiting in the lobby. All right. So here he is. Bert currently holds a PhD in philology. He is a secondary school Latin teacher and a lecturer on historical subjects. But you're also a practitioner, starting historical fencing in 2007. But I believe it was a silver medal in the Swordfish 2011. I just actually watched that match. It was a good match. And the following year at Swordfish, the longsword tournament, you made it to the quarterfinals. So also a very good practitioner. Bert Gevaert, welcome to the program.
Thanks a lot.
And Gevaert, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah, that's correct. That's amazing that you pronounce it correct.
Well, my last name is Vredenberg or Vredenberg, so I get used to trying to spell difficult or pronounce difficult names. So you're here today to talk to us about Belgian shooting and fighting guilds, of which you are a member. Is that correct?
So I'm a member of the Guild of Saint Michael. So I'm living in the city of Bruges, which is situated in Flanders. And in medieval history, Bruges was one of the most important commercial cities because we had a huge harbor, and we were a bit in the center of trade routes, and so it was a very important city. And we had people coming from all over Europe to Bruges, and foreign merchants. They had their embassies in Bruges, so it was a very important city on the economical field. The Dukes of Burgundy also had their headquarters in Bruges at a certain moment in history. Flanders was very wealthy. So we have a very long tradition of fencing, fighting, and all that kind of stuff, because in those days we also needed to protect ourselves. And in the city of Bruges, we had originally 5 armed guilds. So in a medieval city, you had guilds. So you had the guilds of the shoemakers, you had the guilds of the candle makers, also trade guilds. Besides that, you also had religious guilds. And then you also had armed guilds. So in Bruges, 5 armed guilds. You had the guild of the longbow shooters. You had the guild of the crossbow shooters. And they had 2 guilds, one old guild and a young guild. And then we had the guild of Saint Barbara, the gunners. And then the 5th armed guild was the guild of the fencers. And they were all named after a saint. So you had the guild of Saint Sebastian, handbow, guild of Saint George, crossbow, guild of Saint Barbara, the gunners, and guild of Saint Michael, fencing. So I'm a member of the guild of Saint Michael.
Oh.
Was there any sort of any correlation on why each one was designated the saint that they had? Like, I know that Saint Michael, and like, how do they pick which saint?
Well, usually if you look at images of saints, they are depicted with a weapon. So normally Saint Michael, the archangel Michael, is always depicted with a sword.
Yeah.
Because you can read it in the Bible that with a flaming sword he casted out Adam and Eve out of the paradise. So he's always depicted with a sword, and he fights against the devil. But Saint Barbara, for instance, that's actually very funny, because Saint Barbara, according to the legend, she was locked up in a tower, and the tower has the shape of a gun, a medieval gun. So they said, okay, she's always depicted with a tower, and the tower is very small next to her, because it's typical for Saint Barbara. She was locked up in a tower with 3 windows, because you have the Holy Trinity. So always depicted with that tower, and from a distance it looked a little bit like a gun. That's the reason. Saint Sebastian was killed by arrows,
Yeah.
so he's the patron saint of the longbow shooters. And Saint George, he was also a knight. He was actually more important. He was a real knight, not an angel. So knight, crossbow connection.
Cool. So, when do we start first seeing like the appearance of the guilds? Like at what point in history? The fighting ones, not just the tradesmen.
Yeah.
Fighting ones.
Well, that's actually a bit a difficult question. We think that already in the 13th, 14th century, we had these armed guilds, okay? So there are references in archives, in city archives, to these armed guilds. And we know that they are organized. It's not just people walking with longbows and with weapons, but they are organized. They have a captain and they have banners. So having a banner means that they have a sort of organization and that they are recognized by the city. And there is a very famous chest, the Oxford chest. And on that Oxford chest, it was probably made beginning of the 14th century. You can see some armed guilds. You can see people who are defending Bruges and fighting on the battlefield. And they are depicted with crossbows, with longbows. And they also have banners. So maybe that's one of the first references to these guilds. But we are pretty sure we already had them in the 14th century. But my guild, so the Guild of St. Michael, the first references date back to the beginning of the 15th century. We know that they already organized tournaments, but we were officially recognized, because you had to be officially recognized, in 1521. When a guild was officially recognized, it received funding from the city. So that was important. And you could also participate in religious processions in the city. So that was also a sort of symbol that you were officially recognized by the city.
Now, it sounds like the guilds were very much like a very organized thing, like a very highly organized militia, basically. And at the same time, did Flanders also have a standing army, or were the fighters of the guilds the military force?
That's a very good question. In Flanders, there was always the big discussion between the city. The cities were very powerful. For instance, Bruges was a very important city. Ypres, wasn't it? Ghent, Brussels. So there was always a sort of conflict between the Count and the Count of Flanders. He was the vassal of the King of France, okay? So Flanders has always been part of another nation. So the Count, he had his own army, but cities, they also had their own army. So, and then you had the King of France, and he also had his own army. The Count, he could rely on his vassals, and they also had their small armies. But the cities, they had their own city militia. And this city militia were the guilds. So the first ones officially recognized were, of course, people fighting from a distance, because you're standing on the city walls. You need your crossbow. Crossbow was very important to defend the city, because you pull the string of your bow and then you put the bolt on it and you're ready to fight, okay? And you can do that easily from the walls of a city. Longbow, same thing. The Longsword Guild, they were the last guild officially recognized, because city defense was not going out of the city, but staying as long as possible in the city and then defending the walls of your city. So they were a very important part of the city militia. And also symbol of the authority, the independency, the might, the power, the pride of a city. So very important, yes.
Very cool. So I remember you watched the previous podcast that I sent you, the one with Jean-Rie, right? Maybe,
yeah.
The first 5 minutes.
The first 5 minutes, the cool part where it's just us talking. I think that he had said something in that episode about conflicts between, he wasn't talking about Flanders, but in other Holy Roman Empire states, conflicts between the cities and the nobility. where like the nobles would try to push them around, and because they had their own highly trained militia, they were able to say no. So that kind of explains why the guilds were necessary, because if you're a vassal state, it's very easy for the duke or the count to say no, you're going to do this. So you have to be able to say no if it's your interest.
But it was a problem. It was a problem, because at a certain moment in history, Philips the Good, he asked the city guilds to participate in a siege of a foreign city, Calais, not so very far, well, still a bit away from Bruges. So he wanted to besiege Calais, and the city guilds, they had to participate, but they said, we don't want it. Why should we do that? This has nothing to do with our city. We are not paid to do this. Why do we have to do this? We want to stick to our relatives. They were not professional soldiers, okay? But the counts, the dukes, they had their professional soldiers. Well, it started, okay? It was still small, but these guild people, they had families. They were not professional armies, not at all. They were trained in a way, but their profession was not fighting. They were defending, and that's a huge difference. Why would they attack a city or fight for a count or for a duke or for another noble person if it was not in their interest? A mercenary, professional soldiers, they are paid for that. These guild people, they were difficult to cope with for a count, duke, nobility.
Did it ever cause like are there historical examples of like a lot of friction caused when a noble wanted to summon the militia and they just said no? Did it cause like big problems?
Yeah. There are stories about that. So Philips the Good, he had several conflicts about that, and on a certain moment in history, he took away the banners. He took away the banners of the guild as a sort of symbolical punishment, because he said, "You're not obeying me." And at a certain moment in history, he thinks it is much better for me to use my own militia, my own professional soldiers, my mercenaries, because I pay them and they do whatever I want. And they have no problem with going out of their countries for a long time. They are just fighting because I pay them.
Very cool.
So you mentioned that they were trained, sort of. Can you kind of elaborate on that? Like, how were they trained?
Well, we don't know, but we know that a certain moment in the week they had to come together with the other guild members, and then they trained. But of course, there is a huge difference in how they trained at the beginning of the 15th century, beginning of the 16th century, and the end of the 18th century, because at a certain moment in history, and that's already happening in the 16th century, the military value of these guilds is not so important anymore. So they are not training anymore to fight in war. For instance, guild people never trained to fight in formation. Okay, so mercenaries, Maximilian of Austria, at a certain moment in history, he's using mercenaries. Charles the Bold, they are using mercenaries, and these people are used to fight in formation. But you have to train for that on a daily basis, to train to fight like this. And you have to be able to rely on the person next to you. Also, you have to respect your commander. You have to obey. But city militia, guild people, those were independent people. They were not professional soldiers. They were not used to obey. So on Sunday, they came together to shoot with a bow and arrow and to fence a little bit. That's what they did, because it was in the beginning necessary to defend the city, but later it was just divertisement, because they like doing that, because it was fun. And at a certain moment in history, we see that they come together and that they shoot a little bit with bow and arrow, and then they drink. And then they make fun.
It sounds like a modern HEMA club.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
But if we look at our tournaments, and so we have recorded many of these tournaments of the Guild of St. Michael, and this is what they did. So they had annually their big Kings tournament, and at the big Kings tournament, they drank a lot. They really drank a lot, and that was important. And other guilds were invited, and we know that the Guild of St. Michael had a very good reputation of its wine. So the wine of the Guild of Saint Michael was fantastic. So you can read it in several documents.
Cool. On the topic of tournaments, I'm familiar with what we normally call like the Franco-Belgian rules, where you strike with the flat and you can't use the cross guard and you can't wrestle and all those things. I imagine that's not the only tournament rules coming out of Flanders that we have, correct?
Well, the problem is there are only a few documents that we have with a detailed description of all rules. Okay, so we have very detailed instructions about tournaments from 1723, for instance, used in the Guild of Ghent, Guild of Saint Michael. Then we have small references in documents. Every guild had its own traditions. Okay, we recently discovered rules for tournaments for the Guild of Saint Michael in Mechelen. So that's another city in Flanders. So they all had their small differences in organizing these tournaments, different rules, for instance. But it was important to strike with a flat. You always see that, strike with a flat. And the rule of the so-called free touch, as they called it. In HEMA, they call it the nakslag, the afterblow.
Yeah.
So, but this is also something that you can read in documents of the Guild of Saint Michael in Ghent. But not all the rules. For instance, we don't have the rules which were used in the tournaments of the Guild of Saint Michael in Bruges. We don't have them. Unfortunately, we don't have them.
So if I understand what you said just a second ago correctly, then each of the major Flemish cities, they had each one had a Guild of St. Michael's and a guild. And so was there cooperation and coordination between these?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We know that, for instance, if there was a new fencing master, in Bruges he was called Maître de l'épée longue, Meister des lange schwertes. So he had to pass a test. If you wanted to start teaching, you had to pass a test. And usually the people taking the test from you came from another guild. Okay? So you were tested by masters coming from other guilds, just to make sure that everything happened neutrally. Also, the exams to become master, to become higher in the rank in the guild, the test was examined, was controlled by masters from other guilds. And we know that they went to tournaments of other guilds. Okay, so they were invited by each other to fence in other places.
So that makes sense too, because if I want my guild to have a new master or somebody who is promoted and ranked up, it's of course in my interest to just say, yeah, of course he's a great fencer. Cool, he's done. So they figured that out, I guess, and that's why you had to go and get tested by somebody else so that they could actually verify, like a third-party verification.
Yeah, that's how we have documents about that. That foreign masters, so the master of Ghent supervised the masters to be of Bruges, and he supervised that test. And
now,
they had to pass.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, they had to pass a test on several weapons.
Okay,
that's what I was going to ask, actually.
Yeah, go ahead, David.
No, my next question was going to be ask about what weapons did they have to test on?
Well, it also it depends on the period in history. But usually, what we see is longsword was usually combined with staff. That's something that we see. Okay, so staff was also something that the master had to be able to practice. We don't know exactly if you were a master in longsword that you could also be master in rapier. We don't know exactly. We assume it.
Right.
That they could do that. And in our guild, there are also references to the halberd, of course. So the halberd was an important weapon. The name of our guild is halberdiers. So that was certainly one of the weapons. And there is another weapon that is also referred to and the name of that weapon is houwer. Houwer is a Dutch word for cutter. We think it's a dusak or a brackemaar, which is a sort of a Flemish version of the langesmesser. Langesmes. So that's possible.
So it seems like basically everything that Meyer writes about is kind of included in that. Interesting.
Yes. We also think that.
So regarding the cooperation between the guilds, because it sounds like there wasn't any sort of like hard feelings from Bruges to Ghent or anything like that. Like they seem like they all got along quite well.
Well, actually, Bruges was an enemy of Ghent in history.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there are stories. Well, of course, you have the guild level and you have the city level, but there are many stories about battles between Bruges and Ghent. Okay, so then of course, as a guild, you have to be loyal not to the guild but to the city because you're city militia. So you have to be loyal to that. But I'm speaking now about 15th century, 14th century. Then there were some problems between, for instance, Ghent and Bruges. But later, we don't see any traces of that.
Were there, like with regards to some cooperation between the cities, maybe not between Bruges and Ghent, but were there ever any instances when perhaps like an invading army was coming and it would attack one of these cities and maybe they would call for help from the other cities militia or the guild members to come and help them defend their city?
Well, there are stories, there are battles in which several Flemish cities worked together. We always had conflicts with the King of France, and one of the most famous battles that ever happened in the history of Flanders, which is actually a very small battle, that's the Battle of the Golden Spurs. And we know that in that battle, the joint forces of several Flemish cities managed to defeat the French army. And that happened in 1302. And 2 years later, we are defeated by the French king again. But we never mentioned that battle. But, but that is not just guild cooperation, that's city cooperation. Okay? So in that way, they would cooperate with each other.
I see. So the guilds weren't completely autonomous. They had to, like you said, they had to do what the city told them to do.
You cannot do that. You have to be loyal to the city because you defend the city where you live. You're attached to your city, and that's very important. So the festivities that they are doing, that's in the city. They participate as protectors of the city. When there are religious processions, you participate in that. So it's always your city which comes first.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Let me think. One of the other things I wanted to ask you about is I know that you had told me before, the halberdiers that your club. If I remember correctly, y'all train in the same hall as the same building as the Guild of St. Michael used to train in?
No, that's what people think, but our guild changed several times from location. So now we are training in an ancient city gates, okay? But this is just one of the locations. So we started very small and we did it in that city gate. But it is true, and that's maybe why you're confused about it. All armed guilds are in the neighborhood. So the guild of St. George is maybe 200 meters away from our guild. The guild of St. Sebastian is also maybe 100 meters away. So all important city armed guilds are very close to each other right now. But only St. Sebastian is still at its historical location. But we were at several places. At a certain moment, we were in the city halls. We trained in the city halls. We had one big house in the city where we also trained. So the location changed a lot, really changed a lot. Mm-hmm.
So all of these, all the guilds are still and they're still active?
Not all. So the guild of St. Sebastian they never cease to exist. Okay, so they are still very active, but for them, shooting with the longbow, it's just something that they do sometimes. Okay, so it's a very exquisite club, and it's very difficult to become member of that club. You need to find a sort of godfather, and he will say, okay, you can become member. It is also very expensive to become member of the Guild of Saint Sebastian. And I think when they meet, they shoot maybe 2 or 3 arrows and then they drink. Really, it's very, very, they won't like that I'm telling this, but it's a very utilitarian club. I think they have a maximum of 100 members, something like that. And it's really an honor to be part of it. And then you have the Guild of St. George. They are mainly old people. And so for them, they shoot with their crossbow and then they drink. It's a bit like that. So in many of these guilds, it's the social contacts are really important, and that's historical, correct? So you really you come together with your friends, and I think that's also the reason. It also explains success in medieval history. You could come together with friends, behave like a real man, wield your sword, and then drink with your friends, and no wives at all, just together, shooting, fencing, and drinking. It was like that, really. Mm-hmm. It were social clubs. It's not only the people. It really sounds funny, but it was also in the beginning, the fighting and being able to use your weapon was important. But at a certain moment, it just becomes sport. It just becomes divertisement. This is the reason why these guys hit with a flat. This is the reason why even guys with big bellies can win the King's tournament, and why they have all these rules which makes the tournament not aggressive at all, and which make it possible for even older guys to win the tournament. Because in a King's tournament, as we play it, because you play a King's tournament, luck is also very important, okay? And it's not wrestling, because these guys, they didn't like wrestling. They had beautiful clothes, and then you fall on the floor, and afterwards you have to drink. You don't trust with a sword, because it's a guild brother. So you strike with a flat, and afterwards you drink with your brother. It's like that. Mm-hmm. So it was a very nice and comfy atmosphere with guild brothers amongst each other. And of course, in medieval Europe, you had to fight, but from the 16th century onwards, no fights anymore. Professional soldiers did it. Mm-hmm.
So a fun little side note. The last episode that we did last week, we were discussing what HEMA is and what it really means to be doing HEMA. So I guess Colin and David, as long as you swing a sword a couple of times and you drink beer, you're doing HEMA.
Does it have to be beer?
Well, I guess not. Okay. St. Michael's had wine, so.
No, but I'm exaggerating, of course. These guys could fence. They really could fence, and they were dedicated to do that. But you have to keep in mind that they were not professional soldiers, not at all. They like doing this for sports, as we are doing today. They had their masters, and these masters they studied the sources. But it's a tricky question. What is HEMA? And today it's even politically incorrect to ask people about their opinion. What is HEMA? Who is doing real HEMA? And who is not doing HEMA? And who's...
Yeah, we really had to.
You're very naughty asking me that question. People are going to say, "Oh, he said HEMA," and we have our own interpretation about how we fence, and some people don't like the way we are fencing. And we have introduced in our guild the bloosvechten, and we fence almost without any protection at all, only the mask. We have been training for a long time only with hitting the head. We have studied the sources to do that. I think the most important aspect in HEMA is that you study the sources. You study the sources and you try to fence, not only fence, you can also fight with all kinds of historical European weapons, but you have to study the sources and you have to dedicate yourself to the arts. But some people in our guild, we had a huge discussion about it today. Again, some people want to do HEMA to participate in tournaments. Some people think tournaments are utterly bullshit. And when I was young, now I'm not young anymore, I said, tournaments, it's the most important thing in life. And now later I say, the art is the most important thing in life. And we have several people coming to our guild and they like wielding a sword a little bit and then talking and then sitting in a bar. It's nice, it's fun, it's great. As long as they're having fun doing that, I don't have any problems with that. You have people and they are only studying it from the books. Well, that's also a way of doing HEMA. The art is for everybody. And that was something Kevin Maurer once told me. And that was an eye-opener for me. And we invited him in our guild once. And he said, the art is for everybody. And that's great. You have to think about it like that. There are no people who know what the real HEMA is. And people who are saying, you're not doing it right. Well, that's why.
So you had mentioned that in your club you've been training for a very long time for hitting the head, and that is a very good way to move towards the Heinrich von Guterot treatise, because Colin was mentioning something about that earlier. Speaking of making waves in HEMA, Colin, if you want to throw out there that quote that you gave.
Oh man, okay, I gotta look it up. But
putting you on the spot now.
Oh man, so it was a pretty interesting quote that came from your translation. Let's see if I can find it. Somewhere around B2, maybe.
There are so many interesting parts in it. I really don't know what it could be.
Oh, here it is. Here, I'll read it for you. Let me try to figure out where I started from this. I don't remember. And because they, quote, and because they mostly fight in public spectacles with weapons that are not sharp, but use blunt weapons, they only try to hit the heads of their opponents. They themselves only protect this part of their body, neglecting the other parts. And with their arms, though sometimes not with without any danger, as it were a wall, they protect themselves. Meanwhile, they don't care whether their opponent hits with thrusts or cuts to the other parts of their body. Opponent, meaning he who fights from the other side of the ring. Because of this, it seems that this kind of art is of minimal use in a real fight, and so it happens many spectators are persuaded that knowledge of this art can't bring any practical utility. Great. And this is true about fighters who fight like this.
Yeah, it's amazing. But really, this is what I like about von Guntherod. It's the same discussion that we are having.
I had this. I was
exactly the same. I started HEMA in 2007. Okay, and then you had people, and they were hit on the hand, and they said, "Oh, it's just the hand. It's not important." Okay, only a hit to the head. That's a real hit. You know that you can be trusted in the head, okay, and survive it. And you can have one scratch on your hand, okay, with a rusty blade and die in terrible agony. 1 month covered in pus and being rotten all over your body because of that one scratch, okay?
Yeah. I think we actually mentioned that last week because we were talking about thrusting to the head, because if you hit a forehead, it's just going to skip off.
Yeah, you can survive it. You can even have a blade going through your body and perfectly survive it. But you can have a nasty cut on your hands and don't survive it, okay?
Yeah.
So the question is, and that is a very important question, okay? What is a real fight? We can never evoke a real fight, okay? We have so many discussions about that in our guild, outside, okay? And what is a real fight? It is not possible to evoke a real fight. Von Guntherod okay, in his time, of course, that's a difficult time because we have the 16th century. Soldiers are more and more facing gunpowder, are more and more facing cannons, okay? So what is the use then of fencing? Okay, fencing is still very important. Fencing can be used as the last way to protect yourself, okay, in the zombie apocalypse, when no gunpowder is left anymore, also in the time of von Gunther. So, but many of these guys said, okay, the art is fantastic, the art is great, okay. You have certainly seen the movie of Indiana Jones. At a certain moment, you have that guy, he has his sword and he's moving all these kind of movements, and then Indy just draws his gun and shoots the guy, okay? So that's the story. And Joachim Meyer, he complains about that, okay? Cervantes complains about that. And he said, the art, and you practice and you practice and you practice, and one shot, one small piece of lead, and you're dead, okay? So at a certain moment in history, people are asking questions. What is the use of fencing? Why should we still fence? Because an utterly moron can kill someone without knowing how to use a gun, okay? Even a child can kill the most experienced swordsman. So these Klopfvechter that von Gunther is referring to, these Klopfvechter say, okay, let's make a spectacle about it. Let's just make a nice spectacle. Let's just see it as divertisement. And von Gunther said, okay, that's not the art. The art, that is, being able to kill somebody. Well, in my opinion, both are right. Both are right. Everything in HEMA depends on context. What is the context? What are you doing? Okay? Are you fencing with friends amongst each other, or are you on a battlefield? Okay? Fighting on a battlefield, nobody has ever done this before. Nobody. I have read many reports of soldiers fighting on the Napoleonic battlefields, okay? Guys who received almost 60 cuts of the saber, 60 cuts of a saber, and they survived, okay? Guys who were thrust by a lance 3 or 4 times, they survived, okay? And then you can be unlucky and receive a cut of the sword on your tiny little pinky finger, and you say, oh, terrible, and you run away from the battlefield and you're shot in the back. Okay, what is the art? What is the use of the art? What kind of person are you? It's very difficult. So in my opinion, what is the context? What are we doing? Are we playing? Are we serious? Vechten in Ernst is utterly bullshit. Utterly bullshit. It's not possible. Vechten in Ernst today is not possible.
So
my opinion. Sorry for
no, that's good.
I'll TLDR the entire last episode.
Exactly.
100% agree with you.
So your comments, Bert, about how you can sustain several land strikes and live, but somebody else could get a cut to the hand and die. It reminded me. It took me a minute to find it, but there's this account from the Crusades that one of my students sent to me. And it's called an Arab Syrian. It's from a book called An Arab Syrian Gentleman, and it says, a Muslim cavalier survives a Frankish thrust which cuts his heart vein. I once witnessed in an encounter between us and the Franks, one of our cavaliers named, I cannot pronounce that, who was one of our brave men, receive in his chest, while clothed with only 2 pieces of garment, a lance thrust from a Frankish knight. The lance cut the vein in his chest and issued from his side. He turned back right away, but we never thought he would make it to his home alive. But Allah, worthy of admiration as he had predestined, he survived and his wound was healed. But for 1 year after that, he could not sit up in case he was lying on his back unless somebody held him up by the shoulders and helped him. At last, what he suffered from entirely disappeared, and he reverted to his old ways of living and writing. My only comment is, how mysterious are the works of him whose will are always executed among his creatures. He giveth life and causeth death, but he is living and dieth not. In his hands all is good, and he is all over things. He is over all things potent. And then the next thing, it's a bit shorter. An artisan dies from a needle prick. We had once with us an artisan, Atab by name, who was one of the most corpulent and tall of men. He entered his home one day, and as he was sitting down, he leaned his hand against a robe which happened to be near him, and in which was a needle. The needle went through the palm of his hand, and he died because of it. And by Allah, he moaned in the lower town, of Shizar. His moan could be heard from the citadel on account of the bulk of his body and the volume of his voice. This man dies of a needle, whereas Al-Kashiri is pierced with a lance which penetrates through his chest and issues from his side and yet suffers no harm.
It's funny because it
depends on the person. There are so many stories about. I'm referring to Napoleonic history because we have so many sources for that period. We have so many soldiers who wrote about how they experienced fighting on a Napoleonic battlefield, how they experienced that they were covered in blood, and how they survived. Okay, I read stories about guys who had their hands amputated, and meanwhile they were dictating a letter, and then other soldiers crying, and who could not support it. So it all depends on the person.
I was listening to someone, a medical student, give an account of actual wounds that had been witnessed, like in the emergency room, and this was in Latin America. And there was one example he gave. He was just giving a bunch of examples where people died of things that you wouldn't imagine them dying from, and then people surviving things that you would never imagine. So one of them he gave was, I think it was like a machete fight, and the one guy lifted his arm up and got his arm cut off, like literally his hand cut off, wrapped it up, went to the hospital and was fine. And then the other example he gave was someone got attacked with a pickaxe, right? Just so it's a spike. It stabbed him right in the hand. He was like, "Oh, okay, I'm fine," and he died like 15 minutes later because he just kept bleeding, and it was a tiny little hole in his hand, and that killed him. Whereas the other guy lost his hand and survived.
Yeah. I also heard stories like that. A wound on the head, it bleeds terribly, really terribly, but you can survive it easily.
Yeah.
And the same with thrust through the body. I read stories about soldiers on Napoleonic battlefield, and they were pierced by a sword. So the sword went straight through them. And there was one guy, and he mistook one of his friends because he was wearing a Russian coat. He took him for an enemy. So he attacked him, and he felt so guilty about that he wanted to fight himself to death, but he survived. And then later, he killed several opponents. He was so angry. He said, "Oh, damn, what have I done? What have I done? I killed my friend," because he didn't recognize him because of all the fur he was wearing. And then later he visited his friend and he survived. It was okay. So, some humans are very strong. Some are very weak. Some, different. So
just gotta have that high constitution score, right? D&D players.
Yeah, you're right. So that's a bit the reason why we are saying, if you're fencing with fixed rules and you're just able to give a light tap to the head, okay, you score. And is that fighting on the battlefield? Not at all. But on the battlefield, I would trust, and I would go for your fingers, and I would kill your horse, and I would use sand, and I would use all kinds of dirty tricks. And if I would know that somebody is a champion, I would attack him from the rear with my very bad friends. So this is how it happens. There are no rules in warfare. No rules at all. Yes, sometimes between officers there were some rules, but in reality there was enough. You go for the quick victory. But you can be fair when you're sporting with your guild brothers or with your HEMA friends, if you have them. And then you can be fair. And then you can say, "Oh, it's a slight tap to my head. Nice done." Okay. But again, this is my personal opinion. This is not...
It's ours too.
We all very much agree.
This is such an old discussion in HEMA. It's amazing.
And it's never going to go away.
We're still discussing and arguing about that.
It's one of those things that's never going to go away. Yeah, just never.
Yeah.
I like how we started the podcast talking about the Belgian fencing guilds and their history and organization, and like 30-45 minutes in, now we're talking about how like all the same things that everybody always argues about.
Your mistake.
It's Nathan's fault.
It's my fault. It's my fault.
It's Nathan's fault.
No, but it's interesting. It's interesting, and we should do this more often. And also, that's a bit one very bad thing in HEMA. It's not really organized. Okay, you have clubs in the US, you have clubs in Belgium, clubs all over the world, and sometimes you meet at international events, but it's really not organized as it should be. And this is the reason why we still have all these discussions going on. Who can proclaim himself to be master? Who can proclaim that? Who has the right to say, I'm a master? Who has the right to say, hey, no, guys, I'm the expert in Talhofer? Who gives you the right to be the expert in Talhofer? I know poleaxe. What kind of poleaxe? What kind? Okay. Jeu de la hache? I know jeu de la hache. I've done it several times. Okay. Am I now an expert? Can I give seminars on jeu de la hache because I read the text 5 times and I studied it a little bit? So I'm the expert now. Really difficult. Really difficult. How can we do that? How can we decide that?
Well, I do like the idea of sending somebody away to a rival HEMA school.
Yeah,
rival.
I like that idea. Like, so we have a pretty reasonable rivalry with a few clubs in the area.
Friendly rivalry.
I just imagine like David having to test for a master for the title of master. I think that'd be pretty interesting.
Yeah.
We don't see the other groups in Belgium as rivals, but we invite them at the seminars that we are organizing. They invite us. We have tournaments together. We have that Belgian federation, the SBSN it's called, Societas Belgarum Scientiae Nobilis. It's a Latin name because we have French, German, and Dutch, so we chose for something neutral, and it organizes tournaments, so we don't see them as rivals. But of course, when there is an international tournament and somebody from our guild wins instead of somebody from another Flemish guild, well, another Flemish group, of course, you're more proud when it's one of your members.
So, a question that just occurred to me about the Belgian guilds. Were they ever used for like keeping the peace in the city, like in the case of an insurrection or a riot?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We know that they were used for that. That was also one of their functions. So then they had guard duties. It was. I have read some documents about Ghent where the Guild of St. Michael was involved in guard duties, and they even had a sort of system that those days these people had to guard, other days other guys. So
Very cool.
Yeah.
So going back to the the initial topic of the episode is, it sounds like the establishment of these guild systems, it was used as a very kind of like a very common sense way to get you someone to defend the city from the outside, someone to help you keep the peace on the inside, help coordinate between local other towns and stuff like that, and build relations, and also to help you keep your independence from whatever vassal tries to push you around.
Yeah, that's a very good summary. But also the social cohesion was very important. Okay. Because usually when your father was a member of the guild, you also became a member of the guild. So it was a long tradition, okay, family tradition. So that's also important. But, and I really want to put a lot of emphasis on that we are speaking now the origins 14th century until, so our guild ceased to exist in 1905. So the context is changing all the time throughout history. It's constantly changing. So the militia part was important until 15th, beginning of the 16th century. But then when you have more powerful monarchs like Maximilian of Austria, like Emperor Charles, like the Spanish kings who ruled in Belgium, then we were outplayed. We could not match these professional armies. When warfare became more and more professional, we lost our function. and the defense function, the military function, gradually evolved into a function of social cohesion, sports, festivities, doing these kind of things together. So that's a very important evolution. Mm-hmm.
Very cool. Well, guys, do y'all have anything else?
Well, I was gonna say what. So in your guild, what sources or source do you work from?
Cool. But we are so we started with historical fencing in 2007. We also have Olympic fencing. Okay. So the majority of people in our guild are doing Olympic fencing. So we have about 150 people doing Olympic fencing, foil and épée. Then we have the historical section, and there we have about 50 people doing that. Okay. So the sources, in 2007, we started with Lichtenauer. Everything was Lichtenauer and Ringek. Then we started, only longswords. Okay, we only did longswords. Then in 2011, 2012, we gradually evolved to Joachim Meyer. And this is still our main source for longswords. But meanwhile, we have also a program of rapier. We started with Italian rapier, but now we are only doing Destreza. We are also doing polearms. For polearms, we are combining Talhofer, Fiore dei Liberi, Jeu de la Hache. We are doing the entire curriculum until Joachim Meyer and Neues Kunstliches Fechtbuch. We are also doing dagger. For dagger, we are using Fiore dei Liberi and Joachim Meyer. We are doing military saber. That's also one of our groups. And that's, I think, a French source. I don't know exactly which one.
Cool.
So we are actually using a lot of sources. Really a lot of sources. But when I teach, it depends on the weapon. So polearms, I'm really fond of Fiore dei Liberi and dagger. But now recently, I'm more and more focusing on Joachim Meyer for dagger. Dussac, Hector Paulus Meyer. Well, Hector Paulus Meyer is also one of my favorites for longsword. But it all depends. But the main author is always 16th century. 16th century. And sometimes we have seminars for our members, polearms, dagger. So we do the warm-up with dagger. And that's usually techniques of Fiore and Joachim Meyer. So it changes. But Meyer is the most important one.
Very cool.
Yeah, it's a long answer for
yeah.
It must be a pretty big guild then. Where are your members at? Like how many members approximately?
Well, we have for the historical part 50. But in the beginning we had one small fencing hall, but now we have several locations. Oh yes, maybe I forgot about that. I sent you some pictures with these vechtschwerters.
Yes. We didn't talk about that.
Oh, we can now.
Yeah,
we can now.
Yeah, I would really like to hear about those.
Go for it.
Well, the thing is, I was talking about those pictures that I had, and then I suddenly realized again that we found. So we know that Roger Norling from Roar, he made a sort of list with all vechtschwerters, vederschwert, as some people say, veder. We know that in Flanders, these swords were called schoolswords, school swords.
Okay?
And you know how these swords look, with the typical shape of the blade. And I was doing research for a book about legends of Bruges, and I had a huge book all full of ancient postcards. And I saw a postcard with the entrance of a museum in Bruges. And in that, I've sent you that postcard. And I saw on that postcard, I saw a sword with a very special shape. So that moment I knew we also have in Bruges, we have a vechtschwert. We have one, okay? At least one should be in the archives. So I contacted musea and they could not find them. And we thought, so the postcard that I had was from, I think, 1911, something like that. And I also had one from 1913. So I thought that the original swords, because if you look at the shape of the sword, this was not a museum sword.
Mm-hmm.
This was a sword owned by the guild, because we know when the guild stopped in 1905, because they only had 5 members left, amongst them 3 brothers. So when they stopped in 1905, they give all their possessions to the city of Bruges, to the museum.
Mm-hmm.
So we know they had several swords and also a beautiful statue of Saint Michael. So they gave that to the city museum. And I saw there on that postcard a picture with swords, with vechtschwerter. So I was very sure they should be here somewhere. But the last image we had was from 1913. So I thought, okay, maybe some German soldiers have taken them with them in the First World War. And now, by coincidence, the people of the musea, they are taking a look again at their stock and they are cleaning everything. And they wrote us a message and they said, hey guys, we think we have found something very interesting for you. And so we have found back the old swords of the guild, and amongst them, one really, 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 really beautiful Flemish school sword. So we are very excited about that. But the sword is in very bad shape, and so they are currently restoring it and trying to get the best out of it. Mm-hmm.
So I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. This picture right here that you sent.
Yeah.
When is this from?
This is one of the kings. So he won the kings tournament of the Guild of Saint Michael in Ghent. Okay, not in Bruges.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So in Ghent, they have 2 pictures, 2 paintings of kings with these kind of swords.
So what time period was this painting from?
18th century. 18th century.
18th century. Oh my God.
Yeah.
So they were for a very long time. And also for Colin and David both, just because it's right here. Look at how long that handle is.
I know.
Yeah.
Everybody whines and complains in HEMA. Oh, the handle's too long. It's not real fencing. It's not a real sword. But like, look at that. Yeah. It's there.
But I have sent you a picture with the sword as well.
Yes.
And the handle is pretty long.
This one
handle
here.
Again is really long. It's very long.
Did you get to handle it at all, or was it just in too bad shape?
It's in really bad shape. It's in really bad shape. But the sword itself is about 1.50 meters. So it's very long sword.
Yeah.
Okay?
That is.
So this was also for us an amazing discovery. We said it's crazy that they were so long. But again, these guys were not fighting; they were fencing. Mm-hmm. There is no point on that blade. So it's just because when I was doing research to relocate these swords, people, they didn't understand. That's a huge problem now, because worldwide there are so many people now doing HEMA and have more interest in historical European fencing, but in the musea they have no clue what it is.
Yeah.
And it was a problem for us in Bruges, because I was explaining the type of sword, and I said, it's swords without point. Oh, they said, so you're looking for executioner swords? I said, no. These are fencing swords. And one of the main reasons why they have put that sword away somewhere in a basement in a very bad condition is simply because it doesn't look like a sword. Okay? They see that strange shape on the blade, the triangle, the hourglass shape. They see it and they think, oh, it's not a real sword. And many of these swords, as Daniel Jacquet has written about, many of these swords, they are not beautiful. They are not decorated. You have one very beautiful one in the Metropolitan, but these swords that's for champions. But these were just, if you would break one of these swords, no problem. And the hilt, it was not elaborated, decorated. It was just something to sport with, to play with. When you broke one, no problem, take a new one. And this is a reason why so few of these swords are preserved, because people are watching movies and they want a real sword of a real knight with a point and all the kind of bullshit, because they are not interested in the sportive aspect of what we're doing. They are just interested in the knightly aspect, and that's a shame. And I'm pretty sure that many of these swords are just lost because they were not considered to be interesting.
Yeah, I know I've discussed this with some other people who believe that there's a lot more of them in the basements of museums, because museums usually have so many swords. There's no way they can display them all. So they choose the ones that they think people will be most interested in.
Yes,
but the ones that we might be interested in are the everyday regular swords, right? Or the fencing swords. They're like, those aren't interesting to people, so they're just sitting somewhere.
So many stupid mistakes about these huge two-handed swords, the bead-handed, Zweihanded. And when you see them in a museum, those were the swords used for parades, okay? And when there was a procession, we know these swords. So then you had a sword of 5 kilos, and there was one guy, and he had to wear that sword, and it was decorated, but it was never used. Okay? And people say, oh, look, those guys, they could never fight with it. Of course, they didn't fight with it. They didn't fight with it. It was not necessary. It was decoration. But then again, you have all these stupid myths. Oh, they could not fight with it. Heavy weapons. No, you could not fence with it. It was just rude. It was just hitting each other. And that's still a problem, in my opinion. Still a huge problem. That many musea, of course, there are exceptions. They are not interested. They are really not interested in that.
Same in looking for a picture right now of a giant sword that I've seen flying around Facebook every now and then. It was used by, I think, it might have been a Flemish mercenary named Grosse Piet.
That sword. But
the giant one that's like bigger than the guy who's standing next to it.
That sword. But it's also fabricated afterwards, and he never used that. Just procession, decoration. One swords which were really used were incredibly light, flexible, with many traces of that they have been used. Of course, we're speaking now about long swords. Same with sabers. It all depends on the purpose that you have with it.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Well, I mean, we're right at an hour, which is like exactly where we want to be. So if there's no other questions, I'll say, Bert, thanks again for joining us. This was a fantastic chat. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you very much. It was good to hear from you.
Yeah.
Okay. I hope you enjoyed.
Oh, definitely.
It was interesting for you. And I didn't say different thing compared to the other guy.
No.
Well, more like you expanded on it in the specific area, which is perfect. It's awesome.
Okay. So thanks for inviting me, and for me it was also very nice to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's always nice talking to somebody with a European perspective as well. We're very American. So thank you for that as well.
Okay, you're welcome. I really enjoyed doing this. So if you have any questions, just feel free to ask. You know how to find me. Okay.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, and stay safe, and have a good night.
Bye, guys.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.